When I was a balanced literacy teacher, I believed something that felt completely logical. That if I could find each student's just right reading level and match them to books at that level for my small group instruction, they would make the most progress. So I administered running records, I divided my class into reading groups, and I worked hard to make sure every student was reading at their instructional level during small group time. I was doing exactly what my favorite experts told me to do. The problem was that this approach has never been backed by research, and it actually holds students back. If you're new here, my name is Anna Geiger. I'm the author of Reach All Readers, host of the Reach All Readers podcast, and creator of the Reach All Readers Plus membership. And I help K to third grade educators bridge the gap between research and what they do in the classroom every day. In this video, I want to walk you through what instructional level theory is. In other words, this idea that we have to help students find their just right reading level for small group instruction. I want to talk about where it came from and what research really tells us about text difficulty and reading growth. I recently had the privilege of interviewing Dr. Tim Shanahan, author of this book, Leveled Reading, Leveled Lives, for my podcast. Tim Shanahan has been in education for about 55 years. He started out as a first grade teacher. He's worked as administrator, as a professor, as a researcher. He even served at the National Reading Panel. And what he shared with me is something I think every reading teacher needs to hear. So let's start at the beginning. Where did this idea come from? So Dr. Shanahan believes this practice of having kids read at different levels goes back as far as the 1800s. Teachers were trying to solve a real problem. Classrooms were overcrowded, kids were at different skill levels, and teachers wanted to differentiate. But the formal framework that we have often used today, with specific percentages and criteria, was recommended by a prominent figure in reading education named Emmett Betts in the 1940s. So Betts had been a school superintendent and a college professor and was considered something of a reading guru at the time. And his scheme said that students should be placed in text they can read with 95 to 98% accuracy, and they should be able to answer 75 to 89% of the comprehension questions without any instruction. And that was defined as the instructional level. If a student couldn't meet those benchmarks, the text was considered too hard. It would just cause frustration and would probably do more damage than good. This framework from Betts caught on really quickly because it finally gave teachers something measurable, numbers they could point to, a procedure they could follow. It felt scientific. The trouble is, the science was never there. And here's what I didn't know until I read Dr. Shanahan's book and spoke with him directly. The percentages that Betts came up with came from a doctoral dissertation completed in 1942 by one of his students. But when you look at what the study actually said or did, it's not what you might think. The researchers had students read passages and then calculated how many errors they made. What they were looking for was the maximum number of errors they could make and still score within that 75 to 89% comprehension range. And that's where the 95 to 98% accuracy threshold was set. As for where the 75 to 89% comprehension benchmark came from, when researchers were asked later, they didn't remember. They assumed it was something they just made up. So the comprehension benchmark was invented, and the accuracy threshold was reverse engineered from it. No one ever did what they really needed to do to prove that this was effective for learning. They should have placed some students in instructional level text and others in harder text, and then compared to see how much each group learned, which is what you would need to do to prove that instructional level theory is accurate. Instructional level theory spread as an established fact when there was actually no research support for it at all. And there's also something really important to keep in mind. 3 practical reasons why the system can't work, even if the theory was sound. So Dr. Shanahan walks through all of those in his book and in our podcast conversation. I want to walk you through them now. The first is that it's really difficult, basically impossible, to pinpoint a child's reading level reliably. Because according to Shanahan, the standard error of measurement on the assessments we're using is wider than the window we're trying to hit. That means a meaningful portion of the time, students end up in books that are not at their instructional level. They're actually easier or harder than intended, even when a teacher does everything right. The second issue has to do with book leveling, and this is its own problem. So many of the leveling systems that we rely on are more subjective than we might want to think. Think about Foundas and Pinnell. This was a leveling system I believed in wholeheartedly. I organized all of my classroom's library according to Fountas and Pinnell's levels A to Z, did this for other teachers, in fact, promoted this practice for teachers, because I thought it was useful for helping us find books that were appropriate for kids to read, whether independently or in small groups. The thing is, the Fountas and Pinnell text levels are quite arbitrary. So educators level these books across a wide range of factors. We're talking genre, text structure, content, themes and ideas, language and literacy features, sentence complexity, vocabulary, words, illustrations, and then book and print features. So it's no wonder that we're not consistent, right? I mean, how many of us have had a child in a level J book and found that that book was actually easier for them than a level H book? It's just not consistent. The levels in themselves are somewhat arbitrary. And even Lexile levels have significant limitations. So think about the book Pride and Prejudice, which honestly, I personally love the BBC video version, but I also love the book. And if you look at it and take a 125-word excerpt in the book, you could find that within that excerpt, there is a Lexile level of 670, which is about third grade, and a Lexile level that's 1310, which is college level. And that's just in about a 100-word excerpt from the book. So you can't say that a whole book is one level, whether that's Fountas and Pinnell or Lexile, because it varies across the book, which makes perfect sense. When we assign a single level to a text, what we're actually doing is averaging over enormous variation. And the third problem with this idea of instructional level theory and why it was never going to work in the first place is because when you divide your class up according to instructional level for your comprehension small groups, you're going to have too many groups and students just aren't going to be able to meet with you all that much. Think about it, an average class has at least 4 levels, right? And so if you have an hour for this kind of instruction, they each only get 15 minutes with you, and that's if they meet with you every day. The rest of the time, they're doing less supervised activities, which aren't going to be as productive. When you put these 3 problems together, you have a system that was never going to work, even if teachers did everything right. So let's talk now about what the research actually shows. In the early 2000s, someone finally developed a study to test whether the instructional level approach actually produced better growth. Second graders were randomly assigned to different groups. One group was taught with what they called the instructional level, exactly as recommended. Another group was placed 2 levels above their instructional level, and another group was placed 4 levels above. If instructional level theory is to be believed, the students that were placed at their instructional level would have made the most progress, and the other students would have been frustrated and not made progress at all. Surprisingly, the group at the instructional level made the lowest gains. The group placed 2 levels above their instructional level did the best. In fact, they outperformed the kids reading at their instructional level by nearly a full school year's growth. And the group placed 4 levels above still did better than the group at their instructional level, just not as well as the kids placed 2 levels above. That's a pretty big deal when you consider that according to instructional level theory, those kids would be way into frustration level text, at which point they're not expected to be able to learn. Dr. Shanahan told me that this study has been replicated with third graders and in various other studies. The consistent finding is that placing students at instructional level text either provides no benefit or suppresses growth compared to teaching with more challenging text. And he does emphasize in his book and in Person with Me, it's not that they can't learn. It's just that they learn much less than what we want them to be able to learn in order to graduate from high school and be at a proficient reading level, so they can enter the workforce, the armed forces, or college. One important note before we move on, this research that's testing whether kids do better with easier or more complex text is pretty much done in second grade and above. So when we're talking about kindergarten and first grade, they really need to be reading text with high decodability and word repetition, not patterns where they read words using the pictures or the context, but high frequency words repeated along with decodability. That makes more sense for kids in K1. But once they get to the point where they have a pretty good grasp of the code, we can start challenging them with more complex text. Let's think for a second about what's happening inside of a small group or whole group lesson where the text is too easy for students. When they can already read a text with 95 to 98% accuracy without any support from the teacher, and indeed answer most of the questions, there's very little left to teach. In fact, the lesson is set up to make sure that kids can pretty much already comprehend the text without any extra help from the teacher. I love this quote from Shanahan in his book, Leveled Reading, Leveled Lives. So he says, Instructional level teaching aims to minimize the possibility that words or sentence structures will interfere with immediate understanding. In other words, instructional level theory insists that students are best taught with books they can already read. When it comes to having students apply comprehension strategies to texts that aren't hard, texts they don't need strategies for, Dr. Shanahan puts it this way in his book, and I love this. He says, teaching strategies with texts students can already read well engages them in a fantasy game. It's like saying, let's pretend you're having trouble and I'll show you how to make believe you're solving the problem. What this does is teaches kids that reading strategies are a waste of time because they don't need them. Instead, we should be teaching texts that are truly challenging for students so they see the point of these comprehension strategies and use them when they need them. When students read text that is genuinely challenging for them, real teaching becomes possible. Things like unfamiliar vocabulary or figuring out words from context, complex sentence structures, confusing references. We talk about cohesive ties. That's when comprehension strategies make sense because students actually need them. If you were taught to match students to their instructional level, you are like many teachers. But I'd ask you to consider a different path forward, one that's grounded in what the research shows. Inside the Reach All Readers Plus membership, you'll find reading passages in varying levels of difficulty so you can find the one that has the appropriate complexity for your students. They also come with lesson plans that give you tools for quickly building background knowledge, going deeper on vocabulary, asking meaningful questions, and having students write about their reading. You're not just handing students complex text and hoping for the best. That's like dropping them in a deep end of a pool and hoping they swim. We don't want to do that. The whole point of this complex text is to provide opportunities for teaching. Usually that means scaffolding complex text reading in a variety of ways. I'll be sure to share a video about that coming up in the future, so make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss it. The link for our membership, Reach All Readers Plus, is in the description below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.